So let's proceed with how the land surface models have evolved over time. This is from 1895, an Oklahoma newspaper, the Watonga Republican, which propagated the myth that had existed. I think it was some Cyrus or somebody who first said rain follows the plow. Obviously a disastrous idea. Doesn't work that way at all. I'm not going to read all this, but I heard an old farmer talk one day telling his listeners how in the wide new country far away the rainfall follows the plow. As fast as they break it up, you see the heart is turned to the sun. As the furrows are opened deep and free, the tillage is began. Okay, so even in Australia, which is maybe the land that's being talked about here, this idea of rainfall follows the plow was propagated, and obviously it was mostly about plowing the land and growing crops and making money and so on and so. So this says, I wonder if that old farmer knew the half of his simple word, or guessed the message that eternally true, hidden within it was heard. It fell on my ears by chance that day, but the gladness lingers now to think that it is always God's own way that rainfall follows the plow. Well, they really believed it. But getting into the brief history of land surface, going away from that kind of a mistaken concept of rainfall follows the plow, let's look at some processes. This is the conceptual diagram of the impact of an increase in albedo has on the land surface and some elements of the boundary layer climate. The dotted line represents positive feedback, dashed lines represent negative feedback. Usually it's the other way, but anyways, the land has lots of heterogeneity, right? Whether it's just bare soil, which has different colors, textures, soil moisture holding abilities, vertical stratification, etc., and nutrient contents, carbon content. Vegetation types are very different. Precipitation makes for very different soil wetness and vegetation types, ecosystems as well, and so on. So this small decorrelation scale in everything is very critical for land and for modeling and for predictions and projections and capturing climate feedbacks. But albedo is one of them. So here, just looking conceptually again, increasing albedo should reduce shortwave absorption by the land. That reduces net radiation, decreases latent heat flux, temperature cools down, decreases sensible heat flux, temperature difference is reduced, reduces boundary layer heating, reduces water vapor, decreases convective clouds, decreases convective precipitation, and then you can have a loop where albedo is increased and another where net radiation is increased. So you can see that there are positive and negative feedbacks in the system. Typically, when we do these things, we tend to compute the net feedback by taking all these feedbacks. For example, all these are negative feedbacks because the solid line here is a negative feedback. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 even numbers. So you multiply them, you get a positive. So this would be a positive feedback loop and so on. So here you are mixing negative, negative, positive. So this would be a positive as well, and so on. So that's a very brief idea of how albedo change, which could be because of desertification, deforestation, urbanization, agricultural land conversion, and so on, how they can potentially feed back to the net radiation balance. This is another example of decreased leaf area index. Again, some negative feedbacks leading to soil moisture, increase in soil evaporation, and increase in soil-based water exchange. So that's the slow time scale. And then you have vegetation impacts, again increasing soil wetness and evapotranspiration. And reduced interception loss because the canopy cover and the leaf area index determines that. So that increases the through fall and soil wetness and so on and so forth. I'm just running through them because they are conceptual, and you can pause and look at them more carefully. This is decreasing, so here is increased albedo, decreased LAI, and this is kind of the transition to the models. So the first model from Suki Manabe and so on in the 1960s to start the coupled modeling process just assumed a 15 centimeter soil layer as a bucket for hydrology, filled it up, and then created runoff and so on. So you can see the processes here. So this is the illustration of a first generation land surface model. The terms not defined in the text are defined in reference height for temperature TR, maximum soil moisture capacity W max, and soil moisture content W. So there is a capacity and there is actual presence. And you have the processes of sensible heat flux, latent heat flux, which determines water vapor, and reference temperature. There are various coefficients that go into it, like surface temperature and evaporation, aerodynamic pathway in the lower atmosphere. So basically, very simple, and it would work at lower frequency time scales. At high frequency time scales, you would change these much faster. So these Suki Manabe typically built climate models. He did a lot of climate projection type experiments. He was not a weather forecaster. He was not a meteorologist. So he was just trying to produce something that fitted his purposes, and he did an incredibly good job, right? This is the illustration of a second generation land surface model. So you can see now it's much more complicated with multiple layers, variable soil layers, and each one is exchanging water between them. There is a root zone here as well, which affects the canopy processes and obviously radiation and thermodynamic balances of water vapor and so on. So there is a canopy airspace, there is exchange with the atmosphere, and again the reference height and so on. So depending on the complexity of the exchange of energy between the land surface model and the atmosphere model, you could have boundary layer processes represented, as well as aerodynamic roughness length, boundary friction, convergence, cloud processes, and so on and so forth. So the details of the feedbacks would be much greater. This is ultimately the schematic of the increasing levels of detail being added now into surface modeling approaches. We'll come back to this a little bit later on. The second box represents first and second generation land surface models, addition of vegetation phenology, very detailed, using via semi-mechanistic models of leaf photosynthesis and respiration. Now we have much more sophisticated dynamic vegetation models, which represent more detailed vegetation processes, including some that do C3, C4 plants, competition between them for resources, and so on. Okay, so again, not going here is the digital dynamic global vegetation models, time scales of months to years, so full terrestrial carbon cycle above and below ground, so not only nutrient cycle but carbon cycle, so you have feedback to future climates, and El Nino time scales as well. Vegetation dynamics, months to years, days to weeks here, so you're getting into S2S time scales. So these are the direction of complexities. This is the third generation, so we went from first and second generation, which worried about time scales of minutes to days and weeks, to now worrying about third generations, and the latest ones worrying about months to years, because these are going into the so-called Earth system models, which are used for future climate projections, which we will come back to. So we will look at some details on how operational forecast centers have managed to deal with the requirements for land surface models to make sure that their prediction skills, especially at seasonal to interannual timescales for El Nino prediction, for example, are being handled. They have evolved also, those land surface models, not only in terms of processes and complexities and details, but also in terms of how to couple them to the ocean and to land. These are not trivial matters, because there is a whole series of experiments that are done by running land surface models offline for hydrology purposes, for example, where weather is prescribed in terms of radiation, precipitation, and so on, and then land surface model is run. But in the climate models, forecast centers want to have fully coupled feedback, and then it goes into this first tier and second tier kind of arrangements where we either allow land to evolve during the forecast cycles, or we fix it in terms of vegetation distribution, land surface properties, soil moisture, etc. Okay, so lots of details, but we will leave it here.